Why did he need immunity? Why did he need a pardon in advance? I think he was vulnerable. I think he had a lot of liability on creating coronavirus.
So recently, RFK Jr. was on Tucker Carlson's podcast talking about the true reason why Anthony Fauci was pardoned, even after all the schemes that he laid in place to shut down society and give governors blanket control over our lives and brought totalitarianism to the American shores for the first time in my lifetime to that degree. So let's watch what he has to say about this and let's react. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
So one of the reasons that the system has become so corrupt, I think it's fair to say, is Anthony Fauci, one of the longest serving federal employees who was the subject of one of the best-selling books of a couple of years ago, which you wrote, The Real Anthony Fauci, amazing book. And all this information about him was exposed to the world, and he gets some sinecure at Georgetown and still has Secret Service protection. He seems to be thriving.
He doesn't have Secret Service protection
any longer.
No, President Trump took that away from him. But he got immunity. Why did he need immunity? Why did he need a pardon in advance?
What do you think the answer is?
I would be speculating, but I think he was vulnerable. I think he had a lot of liability on creating coronavirus. He was funding precisely that research at the Wuhan lab.
Yep.
And he was giving them the technology. He was giving them, he gave them not only the technology, the precise technology for developing that pathogen, and published about it, by the way. And the publications credit NIH for financing the studies, but.
Yeah, if this was a movie, people wouldn't believe it. That the architect of the lockdown regime, Fauci himself, the head of the committee that essentially gave cover to the U.S. governors to shut down their respective states, to, give Trump the impetus to launch the Emergency Act and invoke the Strafford Act to really lay the groundwork for the lockdown regime, is given a blanket pardon by Biden. And you had to wonder why it's a blanket pardon to begin with. A lot of these pardons usually enumerate the charges through which that person should be absolved of, but he gets a blanket pardon. And I do think the answer is clear. I think RFK Jr. is right about that, is because he was implicated in the creation of coronavirus. And remember, when we said this way back in 2020 and 2021, we were called conspiracy theorists if you held to the lab leak theory of how this virus got created, where the gain of function research that the US was funding and the NIH was involved in and Fauci himself was involved in actually created coronavirus, and it leaked out from that lab. At the time, we had all these differing hypotheses that said, oh, it was a wet market in China. It was a seafood market nearby in Wuhan. And, all this stuff about how you were a conspiracy theorist if you believed in the lab leak theory. But as time went on, I think that's pretty vindicated, and it's now considered the leading theory of how this was created. RFK is right to describe it as such.
He also gave them, one of his fundees, Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina, developed a technique called the seamless ligation technique, which is a technique for hiding the laboratory origins of a manipulated virus. So that normally, if there's a virus manipulated, you can look at it, researchers can look at it, they can look at the DNA sequences, and they can say this thing was created in a lab. But Ralph Barrick had developed a technique that he called the no-seam technique, and its technical name was seamless ligation. And it was a way of hiding evidence of human tampering. What is the public health rationale? If you were interested in public health, you would want to be doing the inverse of that. You would want to be pinning red flags all to it and
Yeah, and maybe learn from this for the future when aspiring politicians that are ambitious try to cite this as reason for a new national emergency where we have to impose curfews and religious worship restrictions, and you can't assemble. You can't, have grievances against your government in public locations because we're shutting down society. People in the worst states that dealt with this had to wake up in the morning, listen to the radio, watch TV, or get their news however they could to see if they could even go outside that day. Grandparents died alone because of this madness, this lunacy, and it's destroyed lives. It's taken people away from their social lives and all the ramifications that come from that, the despair, the suicides. This is tangible, and this is played out as a result of all this madness, and it becomes clearer and clearer that heads won't roll. And it's not just Fauci, it's Rochelle Walensky and the head of the NIH, Francis, under Trump in the first term. A lot of people deserve to go down for this, but they won't, because this is politically incorrect to deal with government officials in this way, even when they wage and impose the cruelest punishments on the rest of us that we would be subject to criminal charges for if we did that. If we held someone under duress, under the house arrest in their homes, not letting them pass through their homes, well, you're depriving that person of their lives. That's robbing them of due process. It's taking their life, liberty, and property without, a trial. So that is what we're up against. This is the regime, and they're going to have this as a precedent now for the future to exploit. Anytime they want to cite, a gun emergency or a climate catastrophe, they can invoke these same draconian measures to destroy our lives again. And that's the worst thing about this stuff.
This was created by people.
That's what you would do if you were creating viruses for biological warfare.
Right, that's right. And that's another question, is why would he give it to the Chinese? I mean, that was a military lab. It was run by the military.
It's hard to even understand that. What would be the rationale for doing that?
I try not to look in other people's heads. I try, like in the Fauci book, I never look in and speculate about what his motives are. I just say this is what he did. But I do think that there's this, among a lot of the people who were doing that kind of research, the gain of function research, there are big career, economic, and professional incentives to break new ground and say, I just, one of his fundees created a avian flu virus, which can be very deadly to humans if you can make it do human-to-human transition.
Yeah, he's being remarkably professional while in public life, the head of the Health and Human Services department. He's the czar of that department. Jay Bhattacharya is thankfully underneath him now. I think that's probably the best official in the entire Trump administration, probably. But he is being remarkably charitable here, not to judge Fauci's motives. His book, I think, is a little bit more scathing than he writes, but he is true that he just talks about, how pernicious this behavior is and not, Fauci's motives in it. But, unfortunately, we'll never get punishment that's due to Fauci because this precedent is going to stand, and he was given this blanket pardon. So the Trump administration's hands are tied to some extent, but not on everyone. Some of the COVID criminals walk among us. Many of them are still involved in the administration, still involved in these HHS posts. They're top-ranking bureaucrats underneath Kennedy. So, yeah, we're going to live through this madness again. They're going to invoke the same arguments when they want to shut down society again and bring us under the control of another totalitarian regime, which this was. I'm not apologizing for calling it that, because that's what the COVID regime was.
Transmission. And he developed one that could jump to mammals. Why would you do that? You're inviting a catastrophe, and,
yes.
And they published it and bragged about it. And I think there's this kind of, I don't know whether I would call it a God complex or something, where, some of the people in that field seem to have this kind of, get some kind of sense of omnipotence or something from, developing something that can kill all of humanity.
Yes.
That's the most sick and twisted thing. I have no doubt that that exists, especially those who seek power more than anyone might be inclined to embrace that, but that is sick and twisted and belongs nowhere in government. If you're that personality type, that's worse than Dahmer or Ted Bundy in many regards, because that puts human suffering on such a larger scale than those mass murderers could have ever aspired to. So, yeah, this is scary stuff.
But I don't know. That is sheer speculation.
That sounds right to me. So it sounds like Fauci is beyond the reach of the law at this point.
Yeah. I think generally, unless there was a truth commission, which they did, and as you know, in South Africa, and
Yes.
they did it in Central America after the 1980s wars there, and they were very, very helpful to those societies. And, I think we should probably do something like that now. And in those cases, what happens is you have a commission that hears testimony on what exactly happened. Anybody who comes and volunteers to testify truthfully is then given immunity from prosecution. But so that at least the public knows who did what.
Yes.
And people who are called and don't take that deal and purge themselves, they then can be prosecuted criminally.
Yeah, so look, I'm with Kennedy on this one. There doesn't seem to be much legal recourse to holding Fauci himself accountable. But again, he's not the only one. And by the way, Trump was complicit in invoking the Emergency Act and the Strafford Act. A lot of people always say, well, it was just the state governors that did this stuff. And that's partially true, but only partially true, because the governors continued to cite these emergency acts and these decrees and these guidelines that the feds were putting out as cover, as justification to lay the groundwork for their own COVID regimes and COVID responses in their respective states. And guess what? Even Ron DeSantis did that. The so-called hero of the lockdowns. And I'll be honest, he did a very good job in reopening Florida. He had some of the true scientists that actually understood this, speak about why it's nonsensical to shut down society, why it's nonsensical to have cloth masks, which everyone, rejects now as being a stupid solution. The 6-foot rule, which even Fauci said came out of somewhere, came out of nowhere, just came out of the ether. That's literally what he said in congressional testimony, and I believe 2023. He admitted that. But that's where we're at. And I think Fauci is one of the worst supervillains in U.S. history of the deep state. And I think that there's only a few that come close to, ruining as many lives as his policies did. Some of which are Arthur Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover. Arthur Dulles for, turning the CIA into a regime change edifice that dictated U.S. Foreign policy, regardless of what the electoral outcomes were in regard to the president or Congress. He enacted 3 major coups and tried to enact a 4th before he was dismissed by JFK for the disastrous Bay of Pigs debacle. He threw a coup in Iran in 1953, which, by the way, continues to rear its ugly head. The U.S. continues to try to be involved in war with that country because of the reaction to that coup. It brought a police state to Iran and a secret police, a censorship regime that culminated in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and we're dealing with that regime. That's the one that they say is going to wipe Israel off the map and has nukes and all this nonsense. He also wanted regime change and got it in Guatemala. He wanted regime change and didn't get it in the CIA maneuver in the Dominican Republic, where there was a CIA assassination attempt on Rafael Trujillo. He eventually was assassinated, I believe, but Dulles tried to plan that. And then the Bay of Pigs debacle, which it seemed like the CIA knew would fail, but they had hoped and aspired that Kennedy, once he saw this loss of life, would greenlight the complete regime change operation of Cuba. It was disastrous and designed to kill people. And it was designed to use Americans as cannon fodder just to convince Kennedy to do this. Of course, Kennedy was pissed off at him, and then he went on to the Warren Commission, and we know how that went. J. Edgar Hoover, when it comes to COINTELPRO, wiretapping without a warrant, violating the Fourth Amendment. That's what we get from him. But with Fauci, we got the shutdowns, the lockdowns, the terrible COVID regime that brought totalitarianism to the American doorstep in a way we had never seen. Not even the Patriot Act and the DHS and TSA came close to experiencing what it was like to live under a tyrannical regime to that extent. But I do want to hear what you guys think. Let me know down below. Is Fauci one of the supervillains of U.S. history? And please like this video, subscribe to my channel, subscribe to Tucker too, he's awesome, and consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. If you become a YouTube member, you get early access to my videos and you support the channel. I really appreciate that if you go that length. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.